Everyone, this is Pastor Casey, the Queerly Faithful Pastor, and we are going to be releasing our show a little bit early this month as an attempt to encourage people to get out to vote. These are serious times. I don't really need to say much more than that, but the reality is that these are serious times, and this midterm election cycle is probably one of the most important cycles up to this date, in my lifetime at least. And we understand that, around the country, whether that be in school boards or city councils or supervisor positions or, things much larger than that, senators and congress people, there is an attempt to erase the voices of queer people, of people of color, to take away the rights of women and their ability to speak for their own bodies and make their own choices. And most of that comes from, quite frankly, evangelicals and the religious right, whose religious nationalism is starting to impact and infect our society in very detrimental ways. And so today I'm having a conversation with my friend, my very good friend, Paul Barnes. He is an award-winning freelance theater director. He has worked at most Americans' leading regional theater companies, Shakespeare festivals, and university training programs. He was born on the East Coast. He grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. He taught in Stockton, California, and has just done great work all over the country. He became the education director at the Ashland, Oregon Shakespeare Festival and conservatory director and associate artistic director for the PCPA Theater Fest in Santa Maria, California in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He's founded two theaters, the Oregon Cabaret Theater in Ashland, Oregon, and the Great River Shakespeare Festival in Winona, Minnesota. In 2019, he became involved in the Pete Buttigieg campaign for the 2020 Democratic Party presidential nomination, first as a contributor, then as a successful grassroots fundraiser, and finally as a member of Pete's Artistic Policy Advisory Committee. After Pete stepped down in March of 2020, he moved to Joe Biden's Policy Advisory Committee for the arts as well. Becoming actively involved in Pete's campaign was an inspiring and life-changing experience for him, and it proved to be the ideal antidote for the fear and depression that he felt during the Trump years. Thanks to the encouragement of his friends, he published a memoir called Paul for Pete: Politics, Theater, and Life, currently in its third printing, soon to be released on audiobook form. Although Pete's campaign is the spine and through line of the book, Paul for Pete also delves into his work as a director, his travels around the United States, and his life as an openly gay man in the last half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century. He makes his home in Ashland, Oregon with his partner of 47 years, actor and director Jim Edmondson. And I will tell you that this is an inspiring conversation. It is a passionate conversation around just doing the right thing. Oftentimes when we are most anxious, our bodies tell us to do something. And if we don't do something, that's when the anxiety takes over. And so, this is your moment, friends, to get out and vote. May this episode today encourage you and bring life to you and help you feel like, there might be something I can do in these days. And so I hope you find that to be true. Enjoy the show. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Queerly Faithful podcast, where on every first Monday of the month, we push against the norms of Christianity and culture from a queer progressive Christian perspective. I am Pastor Casey, the Queerly Faithful pastor, and this is a Queerly Faithful podcast. Welcome to the show. Hello, Paul. How are you?
Hey, Casey, I'm fine. How are you?
Good. So, on the show today, as you heard, everyone, we have Paul Barnes with us today, who has quite the resume, as you heard, as I laid that out in the at the beginning of the show, the bio. Um, you have done so much, Paul, so much for the world and for us, and we are so grateful for you. So, again, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the nice introduction.
Of course, absolutely. So, I would like to hear, we definitely are going to support your book today and encourage people to pick it up. I feel so honored to have a signed copy of that book, but I would really just love to hear from you, aloud for those who maybe have not read your book. Take it from there.
Well, okay. I guess somebody has described the book "Paul for Pete: My Hero's Journey," which I didn't set out to write, nor did I really set out to experience it, but apparently that's what I did. And It begins really in earnest on election night 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the electoral college vote and plunged me and just about everybody I know into a state of despair that just grew darker and deeper over the months of the Trump administration. And then in February of 2019, uh, Pete Buttigieg emerged on the scene as somebody who was thinking about declaring his candidacy for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination in 2020. And, I had heard of Pete. I knew a little bit about him from his run for the chair or the chair of the Democratic Party. Uh, Sorry, losing that thread. But I began to find out a lot more about him, and he really inspired me. And he inspired me to get involved as a volunteer on his campaign. I should be energy and emotional capacity to do more fundraising. It's an exhausting thing to get involved in, although for me it was very inspiring because I believed so wholeheartedly in Pete. Opportunity to meet Pete several times throughout the course of his campaign in person and via Zoom. He continued to inspire me and restore a lot of my faith. And then when he suspended his campaign in March of 2020, I made a lateral transfer onto Joe Biden's Arts Policy Advisory Committee and sort of followed through and finished out the campaign, working on or volunteering for Joe's campaign. Um, After a while, after the election and Joe's win, I decided I should write down my experience of working on Pete's campaign, of volunteering for his campaign, and maybe give it as a kind of stocking stuffer to whatever I came up with as friends who had supported me through this journey with Pete. But then friends suggested that I had a book in what I had experienced. And so I thought, okay, all right, I'll try writing a book. It's pandemic time. I've got some time on my hands. I'll see what happens. And it turns out the book is definitely, the spine of the book is definitely, Pete's campaign, my experience volunteering for it, but it also because I've lived a long time. I have a lot to say. I have had an extensive career as a theater director, traveled all across the country, and lived a long time. I mean, as I say in the book, Stonewall happened when I was a teenager. And so I have seen our country go through the, gay liberation or
Yeah.
queer
Wow.
liberation movement from Stonewall, through to, marriage equality. And So there's a lot about that as well. My own personal relationship of now 47 years. Yeah. So that's kind of what happened. Did I just answer your question?
You sure did. I am so glad to have you here with me today. And as you're talking about sort of being an elder in our community who was a teenager at Stonewall, and then being able to see marriage equality, I imagine that there's probably a lot of emotions wrapped up for you. I mean, I'm sure you lost many friends during the AIDS
Yep,
epidemic, right? Um, there is a lot that that your generation had to fight for so that we could be here today, honey. That's just the facts. Um, and so I imagine for you working on a campaign for an out gay man who is married, and who now has children really means something to you.
absolutely. It's completely inspiring for so many reasons. But, getting back to the initial spark, my involvement in Pete's campaign didn't have quite so much to do with the fact that he was out, although his being out gave him an authenticity that, I was just longing for. And so many people have been longing for, because I think the previous, occupant of the White House, has built his entire life. It's a construct of falsehoods, lies, and untruths. And I was looking for something that I could believe in and that I felt was authentic. And Pete really presented that. And the fact that he was out, so publicly out, as a friend said to me, I spent a lot of the early part of his campaign passing along copies of his memoir, Shortest Way Home, which I really recommend to anybody.
Such a
It's a
great book.
great
Such a
book.
great book.
And especially that chapter, I think it's chapter 14, about belonging, which was such a theme of his campaign. But one of my friends who I gave a copy of the book to, said, so he's someone with nothing to hide. And that was exactly it. He wasn't busy covering up anything. He wasn't busy hiding, his true self. And it was that, authenticity that really reached me. Plus, he's so articulate. He, speaks so well, but it's his ability to reduce complex issues into understandable parts that also really appealed to me. I always came away from listening to him with a much greater comprehension of, issues, all kinds of issues, and much greater understanding of the stakes, and what he believed in and what his policies would be.
Yeah, I really hear you and resonate with that. I remember when I met Pete in the summer of, I guess it would have been 2019. He just I only got a few seconds with him, but I felt like he saw me. He was present. And that just seems to be the kind of person he is, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing about him is that he looks you in the eye and he listens and he hears you. And I felt that from the very beginning. I Early on in the campaign, I got a letter from the campaign when I made my first contribution, and they signed it, "Thank you for all you do," which is moveon.org's signature. And in a conversation I had with a person who at that time was getting, there were like 5 people in a closet in South Bend, Indiana, which is how they described the early phase of Pete's campaign. And my contact there, I wrote to her or emailed her and said, you know, uh, this is great, but moveon.org uses that. And I think you guys shouldn't use that. Plus, for me personally, I found that signature, "Thank you for all you do," a little insincere or disingenuous, because these were people who had no idea who I was, the moveon.org people, or what I did, how much I did, how little I did, and if I did anything, what it was I did besides, send them some money occasionally. And the next week they stopped using that signatory on their communication. And so from the very, very beginning, the earliest days in February 2019, I really felt heard. And every time I met Pete, had dinner with him, was on a Zoom call with him, I had that exact same experience. Looked me in the eye, listened, wouldn't let go of my hand until he, told me what he wanted me to hear. And, it was a great conversation, always.
Yeah. I recently look, the world should not be determined by memes, Paul, but I did recently see a meme about why gay men, the world in which they create, whether that be in
Mm.
nightclubs or in theater or whatever, are so
Mhm.
grandiose, and always so intimate. And the thing was is that it's sort of like, because I spent so much of my life not belonging, when I create a space that is my own or for the people I love, it
Mm-hmm.
will be it will be belonging to the
Mm-hmm.
100th degree, because I have
Mm-hmm.
survived and because I want others to know they can too. And so when you talk about this sense of belonging that you felt in the campaign and with Pete Buttigieg, I can't help but think that, sure, as politicians will do what politicians do, but as a queer pastor, I hear that all the time from both straight
Mm-hmm.
people and queer people. The space you create makes me feel at home. It makes me feel like I'm welcome.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me personally, I'm sort of a rare case because even though I came out in like 1966, 67, I think probably because I was involved in the theater even that early on, I've always felt accepted for who I am and what I do and never judged for it. And I've been lucky. I think I've experienced overt homophobia, only a few times in my life. I mean, there's so much, indirect, covert homophobia that we live with
Sure.
day in and day out. But for me personally, I've had that rare experience, and I always felt like I was accepted and that I had a place where I belonged. And but in terms of Pete's campaign, the sense of belonging permeated the campaign from the very beginning and from the top to the bottom. And he had such a diverse array of staff members, such a diverse array of volunteers. I mean, everybody felt like there was a place for them in his campaign. However, they felt like getting involved, however, they were able to be involved. People were, accepted for who they were and what they did, and nobody gave a rat's ass about anything else.
Right. And so that sort of leads me to my question of, do you think being a gay man and a Christian had an impact on his campaign and on the people, on the like as you were going through the country
Mm-hmm.
working with him? What kind of impact did that make? I mean, that is a bold statement.
Mm-hmm.
This is look, Mike Pence touts himself as a very conservative Christian, right? And
Mm-hmm.
for Pete Buttigieg to respond in such a generous way and a Christian response, I mean, that does say a
Well, the
lot, I
thing
think.
about Pete, as far as I know, and as far as I know him, which is not to say I know him well personally, I know him through the campaign, um, is that he embodies what is for me, a true sense of Christianity and a deep faith that is so rooted in the scriptures. I mean, he quotes scripture and he talks about scripture. And of course, he talks about, Christian, behavior about accepting the poor and ministering to the afflicted and, all of those things that I believe as I'm a Christian, I guess I probably more accurately I'm agnostic or a seeker. I think I would say I'm interested in all of it, exploring all of it. I mean, I was brought up Congregationalist and Episcopalian. That's sort of my background, going back to my childhood in New England. Um, but his faith is deep and deeply rooted in what I think of as true Christianity. What so much for me that passes as Christianity these days has so little to do with true Christianity.
I agree with that
Yeah, it just,
100%.
uh, it's. I mean, we could go there for a long, long time, but for me, Pete, and I just reread in preparation for our conversation a terrific article, a column in the Washington Post from January 2020 by Michael Gerson, who he's a Washington Post columnist. He was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. He's often credited with coining the phrase "axis of evil." Well, Michael's brother Christopher is an actor who I have worked with many, many times and I'm very close with. And I know Michael through Christopher. And he did an interview with Pete in Des Moines, Iowa, just before the Iowa caucuses. I think the date on this column is January 16th, 2020. And Michael Gerson is a person of deep and abiding faith and Christianity in that same sense. He recently, just I don't know, a week or two ago, published a very extensive interview or column, really thoughtful column about Christian faith that I really, really recommend.
Can you send me both
Yeah,
of those,
yeah,
please, actually? And I'll put them
okay,
in the
yeah,
show
I
notes.
can do that. What Pete's said in this interview with Michael Gerson is I recognize there are two different levels I'm talking about. The level where I insist that God doesn't have a political party, and then a more focused level where controversial political beliefs are connected to my faith. And then Gerson writes, and his vision of faith, he affirms, has progressive implications. Um, anyway, it's a great piece, and I really recommend it to your listeners.
Yeah, we'll be sure to put that in the show
Yeah.
notes.
So, even though I might not be as deep and faithful or as well educated a Christian as Pete uh, is, it just struck me that here was a politician who was unafraid to talk about faith and what it meant to him. His view on, abortion I think was stunning in that, one of the things that he said early on was that, we disagree with the idea of when life actually begins. And as long as we don't agree scientifically or religiously, then that decision needs to be left up to the people who are involved, which, come down to the mother, her physicians, the father, if the father is in the picture, and that's it. And I thought, well, yeah, that makes complete sense. There are so many different ideas of when life actually begins. And as long as, there's disagreement about that moment, then leave it up to the people to whom it truly affects. And, stop telling me what to do with my body, and my decisions about my body. You make your decisions according to your idea of faith, and I'll make mine. And he was so clear and so clear about the late term abortion thing about, what a tragic choice it is for people and, frankly, for people I know who have, had to make that decision at a time when, as Pete said, they've picked a name for the baby, they've got a nursery, they've painted the nursery, they've got a crib, they're all ready to go. And then they're faced with this, very, very tragically difficult decision. And it has to be up to them and nobody else. And, so, but, when I traveled because I was within about 8 hours of South Bend, Indiana, when Pete actually formally officially declared his candidacy, which was on Palm Sunday in 2019, I was able to go to South Bend and be there for that announcement. And it's Reverend Brian Gantz is his name, who married Pete and Chasten at the Episcopal Church in South Bend, Indiana, who gave a kind of invocation uh, at the beginning of this. There was a series of people who spoke about Pete, but he was one of the first. The invocation, as he was describing Pete and talking about their longstanding relationship and knowing Chasten and working with them towards the event of their marriage, it became this whole kind of call and response between the Reverend Brian Gantz and the 3,000 people in that building who were there to support Pete. It was really thrilling. And I also have a personal connection to Chasten in that my partners and my great nephew went to UW Eau Claire, and he and his wife were involved in theater with Chasten, and they were invited to Pete and Chasten's wedding in South Bend, but couldn't attend because they were out of state at the time and unable to get there. But so there are all these little hooks involving Pete and Chasten.
That's really amazing. When you talk about someone who lives on the progressive side of Christianity, like Pete Buttigieg, if I recall correctly,
Mhm.
I could be wrong. Any of you who are listening, you can always reach out and let me know. But I'm pretty sure that Pete Buttigieg was one of the only people to meet with the Poor People's Campaign.
I think you're right. I don't know for sure, but I think you're right.
I'm a big fan of the Poor People's
Yep,
Campaign. William Barber is amazing.
amazing.
Um, I took 21 of my church members, 19 from here and 3 from Sweden. They met us in Washington D.C. this last summer, as we marched and just began to believe in a new vision that William Barber and those alongside him are dreaming for our community, our country.
Hmm.
And Pete Buttigieg was one of the only people to sit down with William Barber,
Hmm.
and that said a lot to me about
Hmm.
about his own values and his own Christianity. There are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, the political aisle, who will proclaim Christianity and yet really fail um to see what this is all about,
Hmm.
right? As we talked about, tending to the poor and the needy and lifting all people up, so that they might thrive in the world. These are very important values,
Yeah.
and tenets of Christianity. And to see Pete Buttigieg
Hmm.
I think I am like 90% sure. It is, if there was anybody else, I think it was Bernie Sanders, but I'm not even
Hmm.
sure Bernie Sanders met with them.
I don't.
Um, so
I don't really
yeah.
know, but I can say that it was that kind of thing that struck me about Pete, including very early on his willingness to tread into so-called enemy territory and to go on to Fox News and to do Fox town halls with Chris Wallace and those interviews where he simply said, I have to give people a chance to get to know me. How are they going to vote for me if they don't know who I am, or what I have to say? And his willingness to go all sorts of places. I think his campaign in Iowa was incredibly smart in the way that he made sure to visit every county in the state, starting with the rural counties, not worrying about the urban and suburban districts, but really hitting people in more remote areas of the state, and people with genuine concerns, and people who might have reservations about a queer candidate. But it turned out they didn't have reservations about him, and what reservations they did have, they were put at ease about while they got to know him, and they were much more interested in talking about farm futures than they were about his sexual preference or gender identity. So
Yeah, it's amazing what we really care about when it all comes down to it, right?
yeah.
And I think that for most people, and I experience this even in my own community, I serve in a very conservative part of Northern California.
Right.
Um, and people are most often willing to work with you when we're working for a common good.
Hmm.
They don't,
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of why keeping, LGBT people out of the military was such a big deal. And trans people, for that matter, in the last
Yeah.
administration, because when you begin to fight alongside someone or work alongside someone for common good, then they just become people to you and not some big monstrous issue.
Well, that was, the thing that Pete said about his military service. It was that he was suddenly, working day in and day out with, people from all walks of life, all parts of the country, all kinds of backgrounds, people that he probably wouldn't have necessarily known otherwise. And all they cared about was, could he do his job, which was often to transport them from one location to another in Kabul, and could he get them there safely? And nobody cared whether he was a Democrat. Nobody knew that he was a mayor. Nobody cared if he was a Republican. They just wanted him to do his job well. And, you know, and later on, they found out all kinds of things about him. But in the moment, it's just about who are you and can you do your job? And
Who are you? Can you do your job?
yeah, yeah. And it's not about much of anything else. So,
When we boil it down, everybody,
yep.
that's what life should be built around.
Yeah.
As Dr. King said, what kind of character do you got, baby?
Yeah.
Let's see the contents of that character.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering what you think in terms of, why does representation matter?
Well, if you mean representation of queer people, I think
Yeah.
it matters a lot. Um, and I just think the more you get out there, the more people know you. The more easily divisions evaporate. And I think it's hugely important that we are represented and that we represent, because there are, so many of us. We are living lives right alongside everybody else. We contribute to society in all kinds of ways. I was so struck just yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, watching a bit of news coverage on cable. The number of out reporters and commentators there are that we see every day on our TV screens, and I don't think anybody really cares. Whether it's Rachel Maddow or
Anderson
Anderson
Cooper
Cooper.
or my crush Don Lemon.
Yeah, absolutely. And who was it that there's MSNBC woman, Allison Reiser, I think. Anyway, they're just a bunch of them. And I thought, well, that's as it should be. And, it's great that, you know, even I, a person who considers himself pretty well informed, didn't know these things. It's like when Colbert said to Pete on his first interview, he said, I think it was about third or fourth on my list of things about you that it mentioned that you happen to be openly gay. And that's how it should be. And that only comes from, I think, being represented, and representing ourselves. It's a agonizingly, aggravatingly, ridiculously slow journey to acceptance. Um, but I think, we just have to keep at it. We have to keep doing it. There are going to be setbacks, but there are always steps forward. And, I've seen many, many steps forward as well as steps back, over the course of my life. And we just have to keep representing. So,
I think, Paul, that is a really beautiful uh, sort of invitation for any of us who maybe are not as far along in the journey as you.
mm,
There are a lot of young people who are going to listen to this podcast, and who are in situations now where maybe their families do not accept them,
mhm.
or they're bullied at school, or the negative things that they hear at church, and to be reminded that life is full of steps forward and a lot of steps backwards.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the thing that strikes me right now is that I think times have gotten more fearful than they were a few years ago. Um, uh, the things that we hear out of Texas and Florida and legislation and you know all of that, I really get and understand why people are simply more fearful these days, because I think I think when Trump came into office, I don't blame him for the fear and hatred that's under the surface of American life. I think it's existed, for a long time, this fear of the other, whether it's somebody who's Muslim or somebody who's queer. Um, I think what he did was he popped the lid off. He let the genie out of the bottle, and now people, just feel much more free to express their fear and their hatred of what is different or other. And I think it's having an impact. Although I also am quite aware that, when we watch a lot of news, it's easy to translate what we see happening in a very specific locale and think it's happening everywhere. And I don't think it's happening everywhere, but I think enough of it is happening that we have every right to be concerned, and all the more reason to be involved, to step up if we can, and as you say, represent.
Yeah, one of my youth group kids, I was getting my nails done with her, and she was saying that the support for LGBT people has reduced by 15% or something like
Mm-hmm.
that since the start of the Trump campaign
Mm-hmm.
in 20 whatever. And I said, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true. Cite your source. And sure enough, that night I get a text with an article,
Mm-hmm.
that says it is true that with the rise of fear,
Yeah.
in all sorts of places, we're seeing a decline in the support for LGBT people.
Yeah.
And so I agree that although it may not be happening in California,
Mm-hmm.
well, in most parts of California, and it may not be happening in places like Oregon and Washington, there are massive swaths of our country who are having real conversations about um, the belonging or not
Yeah.
of queer
Yeah.
folks in our country and in our communities.
Well, I think, as you point out in California, and where you are, which I know well because I taught in Stockton for 5 or 6 years. Uh, but I also taught at a very progressive time in education when there was a lot of support for the arts. This is up until the Jarvis Gann tax initiative passed, and then things really changed. But in Oregon, there's the center of the state. Well, there's Ashland where I live, and then you go north to Eugene, and you're sort of safe again. And Eugene, all the way up to Portland, is liberal progressive. But there are huge parts of Oregon that are very conservative, out in the rural farm and ranch land. But one of the things that was so, I thought, inspiring about Chasten in the campaign, at first, I don't think they quite knew, and he writes about this in his book, I Have Something to Tell You, which is such a wonderful book, that, they didn't quite know what to do with him or how he fit in with the campaign. And I don't think he really did either for a while. And then finally, he put his foot down. And I think, he said, stop telling me how to dress, stop telling me these things. If I'm going to go out there and work for you guys, I'm going to be myself. And he insisted that anytime they scheduled him for a campaign stop, that he connect with LGBTQ youth, wherever
Yes,
he
yes.
was, even if it was a small group of high school students meeting clandestinely, in some rural school in Iowa or wherever, that he was always connecting, with those kids, with those students and their mentors. And, I just thought, you go, Justin,
Yeah.
it's fantastic.
I think one of the responsibilities of us as elders is to always be pointing forward,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's one of my favorite verses in scripture, Jeremiah 29:11, something like, I have come so that you may have a future and a hope.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that is the role of all of us who are queer elders, is to point our young people to a future and a hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
There is life abundant waiting for you.
just yesterday or the day before. I mean, this is such a cliche to say, but it's also a truth, I think. And sometimes cliches are truths that we have to repeat because nobody listens. But I mean, it's often said that coming out, it just you're
Yeah.
continually coming out. You come out. There's no, you don't come out and then that's it. And just the other day, I went for a dental appointment with a new dentist for me here in Ashland. And, they have you fill out all these forms in advance and submit them online. And, when it asked, about your relationship status, are you single, divorced, married, et cetera, they did not include domestic partnership, which is what Jim and I have. And so when I went into the office, I made a point of saying to the very nice receptionist who was very cool about it all, I said, there's just something on your forms that I didn't quite fit into. I'm in a domestic partnership. I'm not married, although, we've been together 47 years. So, but I just wanted to make sure you're aware of my legal status. And they said, oh, that's great. They said, that's great. She said, that's great. We just like to know who we can contact or who we should contact if we ever need to. And I said, great. But, it's sort of, you have to continually be ready to continually make the point. I don't think you have to be aggressive. I don't think you have to be hostile. I think you just have to be, who you are and say, this is who I am, and who I am, is absolutely as vital and as important and as valid as the person standing next to me. So, and just, there's a lot of, we work a lot on self-acceptance in
Yeah,
our journey as
that's
queer
right.
people. So,
I am aware that there's an election coming up. This episode will be
mhm.
released probably the week of the midterm elections.
Great.
And that's why I sort of wanted to do this interview with you now, Paul. Because I think it's a great opportunity to, talk about politics and voting. And so I wonder from your perspective, although Pete is not on the ballot, we wish he was.
Right.
I'd vote for him anytime, every time. But what do you think? Why is it important? When we talk about representation, why is it important for LGBT people to get out to vote?
Because voting is, you know, almost our single and only way of making a true difference. Who we cast our votes for will influence who is on the Supreme Court, whether it's, next year or 10 years from now. And we couldn't have clearer evidence of that than what has happened to the Supreme Court, in the last few years. And the fact that, well, first of all, there was, Mitch McConnell, that hypocrite, um, who said, oh no, we can't deal with a Supreme Court nominee because it's an election year, and then postponed, that until the election happened. And then in this election, rammed through Amy Coney Barrett, as a Supreme Court. I mean, so through luck and happenstance and things both out of his control but in his control, Donald Trump got to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. And I think more than anything else, those are the things, those are the choices, the decisions that really impact our lives, as we're going to see. I mean, I'm glad to hear that Chuck Schumer, wants to codify marriage equality, in the Senate, and I hope that all of that happens and works out. But when you hear somebody like Clarence Thomas say we need to
Yeah,
look at Obergefell and all of those decisions, it should scare us all into voting. But we should also vote not because we're scared, but because we are, energized and positive about it, and you know, you know, eager to exercise a right that not everybody in the world has. And it's just so important. And I would also say that I became involved. I became an activist on behalf of Pete Buttigieg and his campaign, and it changed my life. And whether you're a Pete Buttigieg follower or Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren, or who speak whose voice speaks to you and appeals to you, I cannot say enough about getting involved, whether it's writing postcards, making phone calls. I did phone banking. I was terrified of phone banking, and it turned out to be a
yeah, it
lot of
is a lot of
fun.
fun.
It was a very positive experience, much to my surprise. I got really good guidance. I did voter protection observation work. There are so many ways in which you can be involved. I had never raised money for a political campaign. And I thought I'll give it a try. The worst that can happen is I find out, I'm not any good at it. And I found out I was really good at it. And I raised money for Pete's campaign and I was always within his top 20, grassroots fundraisers, and often within his
Wow.
top 10. So get involved, become involved. It's an inspiring thing to do.
I think that it's also not just that not just for I think it's important for us to also say, Paul, that it's not just about those larger campaigns. But the reason why we have ended up in the
Absolutely.
place we've ended up is because the Republican Party has spent, a few decades starting at the grassroots, getting into school boards,
Yeah.
getting into city councils,
Yeah.
getting on
Yep.
supervisory
Yep.
commissions.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we need to get involved. Representation matters the most
Absolutely.
when you're willing to put yourself on the line, beloved friends. You must
Yeah.
get out there. Currently one of my members, Jen Brookover, is running for school board in Rockland. And her opponents
Hmm.
are saying things, like the only things that I take seriously when I make a decision are the Bible and the Constitution. you know and so we need to be sending funds and support to local school board people who are running to stand up against people who see things so narrowly, right? um
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, I mean, bottom line, political campaigns are expensive, and it takes money to run a political campaign. And the number of emails I get or text messages I get every day from campaigns all over the country, is really kind of annoying. But it's how they run. It's how they win. But the school board thing is terrifying right now and baffling to me because I came from an educational background in which being exposed to ideas other than my own, people other than the people that I grew up with, was, I mean, it was de rigueur. I mean, we wanted to be expansive in our thinking and our exposure. And the thing that just baffles me is how is it that people who espouse such rock solid values, as so many so-called Christians do, can be so threatened by, if their values are so solid and so right, how can they be so threatened by a book, by an idea? you know it's just beyond my comprehension, but that doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that it's happening, and those are the elections that really make a difference in our day-to-day lives and in the future. So,
Absolutely. So get out there, everyone, vote, go help at the polls, or go be a poll watcher. Do whatever you can do.
yeah, yeah,
As
yeah.
a community organizer, I remember doing the Get Out to Vote Day rollout, and that is a blast. It's a lot of work, it can be
Hmm.
stressful, but I was so proud at the end of the day when we worked so hard to get 5,000 people out to vote, and we did it. And the proposition that we
Yeah.
were working on passed. There was not a greater feeling than that. Um, and so
Hmm.
I think that that's something just for any of you who are listening, get involved. I think that we only become cynical when we choose to sit back on the sidelines and watch.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And there's a lot to be cynical about, but it doesn't help. And getting involved makes a difference. I will never forget the election day in 2016. I happened to be directing in Las Vegas, and I gave everybody the day off because it was going to be an historic day. We were about to elect the first female president of the United States of America. And I went to Hillary Clinton headquarters in Las Vegas, and I worked phones, I made calls, and I drove people to the poll. It was incredible. So there are just any number of ways to be involved and to make, a little bit of difference, and sometimes a very big difference.
Absolutely. So, Paul, before we close out with that final question, is there
Hmm.
anything else that you wanted to say or wanted to add to the conversation?
I don't think so. I think this has been you know uh, pretty comprehensive. Certainly, happy to talk more maybe another time.
Yeah,
No.
Paul, I'm so grateful you're on the show today. And, if you have connections to Pete Buttigieg, please let him know that we would love to have him on the show here at the Queerly Faithful podcast.
I will pass that along.
I imagine that he would feel right at home here. And he would be reaching a lot of LGBT people and young adults for sure. Uh, but as we close out today, I would love to hear what being queerly faithful means to you.
Sure. Being queerly faithful to me means, having a lot of faith in myself. Not, I think, in an egotistical way, but in the sense of being a good human being. I have a lot of faith that who I am and what I do in the world makes a positive difference. And so I think I'm queerly faithful in that sense. And I think we as a community have to be faithful in each other and in the world around us, even at a time when the world around us seems so, you know, opposed to who we are in the world. which only calls upon a deeper faith in all of us, I think. It makes you dig deeper, and to reaffirm, our faith in ourselves and in the world, in the principles of Christianity, certainly as I understand them and try to espouse them, in my own particular way. But, it's just, we have faith because faith provides answers for that which we cannot know, I think. And so it's important to be specific about your faith and to affirm it and to act upon it. And so whether it's queerly or not queerly, I just think that's what faith is about for me.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for being on the show. For those of you that have not read Paul's book, I will encourage you to do so. I will put a link to the Amazon, so you can buy it on Amazon.
Well, if I can interrupt that for a moment, it's not yet on Amazon. It is on my website, which is www.paulforpete.com. But you'll have that information. Yes. Hopefully on Amazon in another month.
Yeah, and rumor has it you will be able to hear it. Are you going to be reading it, or is somebody else doing that?
It's 10 hours and 40 minutes of my dulcet tones.
I would love that. I'm looking forward to listening to it. I read it, but listening to it in your own voice will be even better, Paul. So again, that's Paul for Pete, and we'll put the link in the show notes. And that will conclude our conversation for today. To add your voice to this particular conversation or to any of the episodes to come, you can comment on the show notes at thequeerlyfaithfulpastor.com. In the show notes, you will find relevant links and a complete list of all the ways to add your voice to this conversation, including the Faithful Talkback, which you can do every month by calling in and leaving a voice message at 916-534-8163. As long as your message is thoughtful and not hateful, we will add your voice to the end of every episode.
Babe, I love you, and I'm so proud of you for chasing your dreams and making this come true. You're doing a great job. I love you so much.
Thank you all for sharing your queerly faithful thoughts. You can also support the show by simply making sure you follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the platform allows it, leave a rating and/or review. A shout out and thank you to the many people who make this podcast possible. To Jeff Manildi for your production help, Ryan Casada for the music, and for you, the listeners, for making this dream come true. Peace out. Go vote.